The city of Troy, where the affairs of men are said to have become entwined with the will of the gods. Troy, where the love between a man and a woman sparked a war that lasted for 10 years. Troy, where a wooden horse brought doom to a once great city. But how much truth lies behind one of the great epic tales from the ancient world? What really happened more than 3,000 years ago? Were the Trojan Wars ever really fought? Did the beguilingly beautiful Helen of Troy actually live? Can she really have fallen in love with Paris, the son of the king of Troy, supposedly the most handsome man of his time? And could the people of Troy possibly have fallen for the trick of the great wooden horse? The story of the siege of Troy is an irresistible combination of myth and legend. But how much of this extraordinary story is fact and how much fiction? It's time to ask the question, what really happened in Troy?
Apart from what we have in classical legend, there are no known facts about the Trojan War. We only know of it from Homer and other classical writings, and between the closest of them and the events which they apparently portray, there is a gap of 500 years.
Most of what we know about the siege of Troy comes from Europe's most ancient literary work, Homer's masterpiece, the Iliad. The title comes from Ilion, the Latin name for Troy, so the Iliad literally means a poem about Troy.
For a long time people thought that there wasn't such a place as Troy because it just existed in this fantastic poem. But then what happened was that an archaeologist called Henry Schliemann came along and put together all the clues in the ancient evidence and went and dug at a point in northwest Turkey called Hisarlik, and he found something which, in archaeological terms, probably matched very closely Troy.
The Greek epic poet Homer is himself surrounded by mystery. Some scholars doubt that he ever existed and believe that the Iliad may even have been the work of 2 or 3 different poets.
The existence of Homer is one of these great never-ending conundrums that will never be solved, but the chief argument for Homer existing is the fact that the poem, the Iliad, which tells us about the siege of Troy, is so very obviously the creation of a single intelligence. It has to have been written or put together, maybe not written, but put together by a single creative genius, whom we call Homer.
If Homer actually lived, it seems likely that he was born in the second half of the 8th century BC, or about 500 years after the events surrounding the siege of Troy. One tradition holds that he was blind, but modern scholars believe that this is another colourful and fanciful embellishment to the Homeric legend. Whatever the reality, the work is the founding legend of the Greek nation. So, as we continue our search for evidence of truth in the wonderful story of Troy, let's travel back more than 3,000 years. Let's visit a rich metropolis that lay on the coast of Asia Minor, close to the narrow straits that leads from the Aegean Sea towards the Black Sea.
The archaeologists calculate the date of the Trojan War on the basis that the civilization that we know as Mycenaean, centred on Mycenae and the Argolid, and spreading throughout southern Greece, that civilization needed to flourish and have the strength to mount a great expedition against a foreign power. The period at which we can best imagine this expedition taking place is in the 13th century before Christ, perhaps towards the end of it, when the great fortresses of Mycenae and Tiryns were built, fortresses which equal in size the fortress of Troy, which they are supposed, according to legend, to have attacked and sacked eventually. That date in the 13th century fits surprisingly well with the earlier of the two historical dates supplied from Greek tradition. And so if we imagine that the Trojan War took place, if it really took place, between perhaps 1250 and 1200 BC, we are unlikely to be very far away from the truth.
But where exactly was the ancient city of Troy? In modern-day Turkey, certainly, but have archaeologists been able to pinpoint its exact location? Has it been possible to provide firm evidence that the Homeric legend has at least some basis in historical fact?
There's been an awful lot of argument since the 1870s when Heinrich Schliemann proclaimed to the world that the mound of Hisarlik was Troy, because obviously archaeologists and military historians looked at this mound and said there is no way that you can have 50,000 men, the Trojan army, within these walls, which is absolutely right, and this has been a bone of contention for some years until recently. In the last several years there have been more excavations in the area, and we now realise that there is the mound which was the citadel. There is a lower town, a very large lower town, and so therefore it does fit in with the idea of the Homeric legends.
But once Schliemann started excavating, it was quite clear that he was excavating a settlement which had lasted a very long time, and the final stages of that settlement produced at different times inscriptions which showed that this place was known to the Romans as New Ilium, New Troy, and known to the Greeks by a similar name. And so if we can accept that the Greeks of 600 years before Christ recognized that this place was the Troy of the legends, then surely we too must accept that this is Troy, for at the time the Greek city grew up, the ruins of the ancient citadel were still visible.
Following Schliemann's excavations, there were two more major archaeological digs at Troy, one that began in 1893 and another by an American team from Cincinnati that started in 1932.
And then work began again in 1988, led by Professor Kaufmann, but with an international team. And a large part of the reason for starting new excavations, again 50 years after the previous lot, was that so much more had come to light in Turkey from prehistoric periods in the meantime, that there was a whole new frame of reference within which to understand Troy, and it was worth looking at the site again.
While historians and archaeologists continue to sift through the evidence, it's the legend of the Siege of Troy that has continued to fascinate generations of people all over the world. Whatever truths lay behind the Homeric legend, it has provided inspiration for such luminaries as Shakespeare, Tennyson, Pope and Dryden, all of whom have fallen under the spell of the story. A veteran of countless movies and stage plays, Brian Blessed is one of Britain's foremost classical and Shakespearean actors. Here, he reads an extract from Shakespeare's timeless epic, Troilus and Cressida.
In Troy, there lies the scene. From isles of Greece, the princes Augulus, their high blood chafed, have to the port of Athens sent their ships, fraught with the ministers and instruments of cruel war. 60 and 9 that wore their crownets regal from the Athenian bay put forth toward Phrygia. Their vow is made to ransack Troy, within whose strong imures the ravished Helen, Menelaus' queen, with wanton Paris sleeps. And that's a quarrel. To Tenedos they come, and the deep drawing barks do there disgorge their warlike thwartage. Now on Dardan plains the fresh and yet unbruised Greeks do pitch their brave pavilions. Priam's six-gated city, Dardan and Timbria, Helios, Chetus, Troyan, and Antenorides, with massy staples, and corresponsive and fulfilling bolts, spur up the sons of Troy. Now expectation, tickling skittish spirits on one and other side, Trojan and Greek, sets all on hazard. Like or find fault, do as your pleasures are. Now good or bad, 'tis but the chance of war.
Discover the past with exclusive ancient history documentaries and ad-free podcasts presented by world-renowned historians from History Hit. Watch them on your smart TV or on the go with your mobile device. Download the app now to explore everything from the wonders of Pompeii to the rebellion of Boudica and the mysteries of prehistoric Scotland. Immerse yourself in the captivating stories of this remarkable era by signing up via the link in the description.
Was this the face that launched 1,000 ships and burnt the topless towers of Ilium? Sweet Helen, make me immortal with a kiss. These beautiful words are taken from Marlowe's Faustus. They were written in the 17th century and were glorious echoes of a much, much older tradition. The ancient legend has it that the cause of the Trojan War was the love affair between the beautiful Helen, the daughter of the king of Sparta, and Paris, son of Priam, king of Troy. Like thousands before and since, we're told they fell in love at first sight. But unfortunately, Helen was already married to the Spartan Menelaus, the brother of Agamemnon, ruler of Argos. Agamemnon's spectacular tomb can still be seen today. Completely smitten by the handsome Paris, Helen fled with him to Troy, leaving her husband understandably bitter and angry. Determined to put right the slight to his honour, he gathered about him a sizable army to make war on Troy. Agamemnon, the king of the Mycenae, was elected as its commander, and the seeds of the Trojan Wars had been sown. But now the legend tells us the fickle gods of ancient Greece, never far from the action in much ancient history, were to have their say. From Mount Olympus, Zeus and the other Greek gods looked down upon the affairs of men. But these were not the joyless gods of other ancient peoples. These were gods that jousted and wrestled, courted and loved, and took great pleasure in toying with the lives of mere mortals. The sea god Nereus is said to have warned Paris that his passionate affair with Helen would spell disaster for him and his people. But by now it was too late. The couple had made off together and were firmly an item. But who was this glamorous woman that had so captivated the Trojan prince, for whom he was willing to risk his life and his kingdom and his people? She was, the legend tells us, the most beautiful woman in the world and a considerable celebrity.
Helen of Troy, one of the great females of legend and some would say of history. She eventually became the wife of Menelaus, one of the great high kings, the king of Sparta. All the Greeks were in love with her. She was so beautiful, so the legends tell us. So much so that Helen persuaded her father to make all the Greeks who were her suitors to agree when she chose one, they would not argue. And if anything happened to upset the marriage, they would come to her aid.
Is Helen attested by archaeology in any way? No. Is Helen visible in the contemporary records from, say, the Hittites or the Mycenaeans or the Egyptians? No.
So the great Greek army was sailing selflessly off to war aboard its mighty fleet of 1,000 ships because of love and honour, and to rescue Helen from the evil seducer Paris. Or were they? Brown Blessed thinks that there may have been a less romantic reason for the Greek invasion.
Of course, the Greeks maintained that they were going to rescue Helen of Troy, who had been captured by the Trojans and had been seduced by Paris. Helen, of course, was married to Menelaus, the Spartan king, and that's why all the Greek states were going to Troy. But I don't accept that. I think the Greek states were going there because Troy was so rich and had gold and bronze and silver and diamonds and you name it. They were jealous of its wealth and its trade, and they wanted it, and they wanted to pillage it, I feel, and share it out. Why not?
The Iliad tells us that numbered among the Greek army were some of the greatest soldiers in Greek mythology. There was the mighty Achilles and his friend Patroclus, Diomedes, Odysseus, King Nestor, and the giant Ajax. From the north of Greece, from Athens, Crete and Rhodes, the greatest military force the world had yet seen set sail to avenge the humiliation of Menelaus. The vast army disembarked from the Grecian fleet and landed at a place called Sigium. Today, the coastline, spectacular though it is peaceful and quiet, unlike the days when the hustle and excitement attended the landings. Stretched out before them, the Greeks could see the long hills beyond which the rivers Scumanium and Simius flowed across the plain. And here stood their objective, the magnificent city of Troy. We're told the Greeks landed and built palisades around their ships to protect them from Trojan attacks, but the Trojans were not content to cower within city wall and await their fate. A Greek prophecy had promised the Greeks that after 9 years of fighting, they would, in the 10th year, emerge from the battle as the victors, and Troy would then fall into their hands. The day when a handful of Greek warriors would squeeze themselves into a wooden horse was a long way off. The Iliad records that for 9 years the Greeks lay siege to Troy, and many great battles raged back and forth across the plain. Even the gods were undecided about the outcome of the conflict. But in reality, was there ever a siege at Troy?
There is no evidence of a siege lasting 10 years in the ancient world in the way that's described in Homer. What evidence there is for sieges of cities, which is, as far as the Greek world certainly is concerned, is all much later evidence. And it's of much shorter duration, normally a matter of months, really. You get fairly exceptional ones at the start of the Peloponnesian War in the 5th century. The siege of Potidaea lasts for about 3 years. That proved an immense drain on the resources of the Athenian Empire, which was a very rich state of its time. And what's more, these sieges tended to end by starvation. The besieged city gives up in the end if they can't break their way out. Actual storming of a city, virtually unknown in the classical period. Evidence from other cultures more contemporaneous with the Trojan War shows some more evidence of siege warfare, of storming, but these generally seem to be conducted in the course of a single military campaign over the course of a year. You couldn't conceivably encamp and provision an army of the size Homer describes on the plain of Troy for anything like 10 years or even a couple of years. It's obviously a dramatic exaggeration at the very least.
Neither side were fighting unaided. Homer tells us that Aphrodite, the goddess of love, and Ares, the god of war, supported the Trojans, while Hera, the wife of Zeus, and Pallas Athene were hoping for a Greek victory. Meanwhile, Zeus himself, the uneven-tempered king of the gods, assisted first one side and then the other.
There's very little evidence actually on the ground for a battle having taken place, or indeed the 10-year siege of Troy. What we've got to remember is in Homer, in his Iliad, it's only the end of the siege, the 10th year. Troy had been besieged for 9 years. They came to triumph in the 10th. So obviously there was a lot of fighting backwards and forwards. Homer tells us of the chariots and such like racing round the plain of Thessalic. But this kind of thing doesn't leave much evidence. The only evidence we've got comes from the excavations initially by Heinrich Schliemann, subsequently by his assistant Dortfeld, and then by the American Carl Blagan, where on the Citadel Mound we've found walls, this stratification, and there is evidence there of burning, of a city being destroyed. But in terms of actual evidence of battles, weapons and such like lying about, not the kind of thing which is left anyway. You've only got to think of a modern battlefield. All the scrap is cleared away very shortly afterwards. So evidence in terms of material aspects is a little difficult other than the actual structure in the mound itself.
The simple narrative of the Trojan Wars tells us not only about the fighting between the Trojans and the Greeks, but also about the great quarrel between the poetic hero Achilles and Agamemnon, the king of the Mycenae. Inevitably, perhaps it was another woman, Briseis, a Trojan taken from Achilles by Agamemnon, who caused the argument. Briseis was also the daughter of one of the priests of Apollo, and the god was said to be so displeased with Agamemnon that he unleashed a storm of arrows from his heavenly bow against the Greek warriors. Apollo's revenge against Agamemnon was terrible, as for 9 days the arrows are said to have rained down, and everywhere there was fire from the burning of corpses.
Of Agamemnon, historically and archaeologically, we know nothing. We only know him from the legend, so the situation is the same for him as it is for Helen in that respect. Heinrich Schliemann, incidentally, did dig at Mycenae. Many people will know that he found a gold mask, a gold burial mask, which he attributed to Agamemnon. The connection is completely undemonstrated, and probably wrong, because the mask is quite a lot earlier than Agamemnon would have been.
The prophets told Agamemnon that unless the gold returned to Achilles, the miseries of the Greeks would never end. As for the great warrior himself, he was so disgusted by the king's selfishness and greed that he and his men stayed on their ships and took no further part in the fighting. The catastrophic argument meant that the Greek army was deprived of its greatest hero, and it was shortly to be confronted by the awesome strength of Paris's brother, the mighty Hector. Although the story of the siege of Troy is rooted in myth, the fighting, as described in the Iliad when it began, would have been typical of the savagery of combat in ancient times. This was war at the sharp end, with no quarter asked and none given. This was war in which men stood toe-to-toe with their enemies. Brian Blessed describes the bloody realities of the battle.
The hand-to-hand fighting, warfare today, is from a long distance generally, but then it was hand-to-hand. Out would come the Trojans, they'd open their gates, and out would come the Greeks. with their shields and their short swords and their helmets. And both the Trojans and the Greeks fought in the same way. That meant that the armour covered their upper body down to their stomachs. Their part of their legs were revealed, and then their shins were covered up, generally speaking, and the helmet would cover the face. And therefore the target was the inner thigh of the legs. And that's what you aim for with your big spear, your short sword. You try to get into the inner thigh. If you could cut the inner thigh, even today, once you cut it, the wound will pour out, the blood will pour out of your body, just like Niagara Falls.
And as the blood poured, neither side gave or expected mercy in this brutal war of attrition. The legend says that corpses, their spilled blood staining the plain red, lay strewn between the Grecian ships and the walls of Troy. The battle raged over the plain all day, only ending when darkness fell. During the night, a truce was arranged to allow both sides to collect and cremate their dead. There were so many, we're told the work went on throughout the night. The corpses of friends, companions and comrades were retrieved from the carnage, and men were reduced to tears by the sight of their shattered bodies.
The Iliad is a story of war, and on the whole it's a story of single combat between heroes on the Greek side or the Trojan side, such as the epic struggle between Hector and Achilles, which is the climax of the whole of the episode that we call the Iliad. One of the striking things about the weapons described by Homer and about the armour which the heroes wore, shields as tall as towers that they could almost hide behind. These weapons and this armour match remarkably well the remains we have of the Mycenaean period, the 13th century before Christ, at which we would be happiest setting the epic struggle. The context of the battle, the context of the expedition from Greece against Troy. And it's the comparisons between the epic and the archaeological finds which make us believe that much of what Homer tells us has a basis in real historical truth.
The legend says that the following morning the bitter fighting began once again, but that no side could gain the upper hand. So the gods decided to take a hand, and Zeus himself intervened on behalf of the Trojans. Now that they had the mighty king of the gods on their side, the Trojans began to sweep all before them, and it was only the arrival of darkness that saved the Greeks from complete annihilation. That night the confident Trojans camped on the plain around the Scamander River, and the end seemed nigh. The Greeks, staring defeat in the face, pleaded with Achilles to help them in their dark hour of need. But their pleas fell on deaf ears. The great warrior, meanwhile, continued to brood in his tent. The breaking dawn saw the Greeks holding on literally for grim death. The fighting ebbed and flowed, but the Trojans could not deliver the final blow. By nightfall, however, both Agamemnon and Odysseus had been wounded in the fighting. Surely now, final victory for the Trojans could not be far away.
One of the great elements in the story of the Siege of Troy, in fact the subtitle of the Siege of Troy, or of the Iliad, is the anger of Achilles. And Achilles sulked in his tent because one of his slave girls, a pretty young girl called Briseis, had been taken away from him by Agamemnon. So Achilles refused to go out and fight. And of course the Trojans realised Achilles was not fighting on the Greek side, and the Trojans were winning. And the gods on Mount Olympus were looking down benevolently as they played, supporting one side and the other. And Patroclus was a great boon companion of Achilles. He pleaded with him to go and fight, and Achilles said no. And we have representations on Greek vases of him sulking in his tent. So Patroclus had the bright idea of putting on the armour of Achilles. And of course he went forth, leading the Greeks against the Trojans. They saw, the Trojans saw and recognised the armour of Achilles, thought Achilles had come back into the fray, into the fight, and of course the battle then swung away from the Trojans for the Greeks.
Side by side with the mighty Ajax, Patroclus fought like a demon, but his reckless bravery was only one reason for his death. For the gods also intervened on the side of the Trojans. The legend says that Apollo removed Patroclus' armour during the battle, and, shorn of all protection, Hector and the Trojans were able to kill him.
Patroclus, who is his kind of personal servant come squire. Patroclus stands by Achilles, doesn't fight either, but then Patroclus starts to get drawn in because he sees what is happening to the Greeks, what the Trojans are doing to the Greeks. So Achilles says, okay, go off, I'll allow you to give them some help, but you're not to chase them all the way back to Troy. You're to stop and then come back. And of course, Patroclus doesn't. He gets carried away in the battle, and that's really how he meets his end.
Ajax had to fight off Hector 3 times before he was able to recover the body of Patroclus from the battlefield. Achilles was grief-stricken at the sight of the shattered body of his great friend. Patroclus was laid out on a bed, and throughout the long night, Achilles and his men mourned the loss of their great champion. Now, Achilles wanted revenge in the only way he knew, in battle. And so the mighty warrior rejoined the bloody fighting, and dead Trojans are said to have fallen at his feet like sheaves of wheat during harvest. But there was one Trojan more than any other that Achilles wanted to meet in battle, Hector. We're told that the old King Priam stood on the city walls and watched as Achilles charged across the plain in pursuit of the fleeing Trojans, who ran for their lives through the city gates. Now, only Hector stood outside the walls to face Achilles. But at the sight of the enraged Greek warrior thirsting for revenge, his courage failed, and he turned to flee. The legend says that 3 times the 2 warriors circled the city before the goddess Athena, assuming the form of Hector's brother, persuaded Hector to stand and fight.
What happens then is that Achilles is galvanized into action. Hephaestus, the god of the forge, he creates for him a splendid new set of armour because he'd given his original armour to Patroclus to wear, and that was the armour which Apollo had magically made to disappear. So with this splendid new suit of armour, Achilles goes off out in search of Hector for revenge. And this is where the story becomes, it becomes very sad and tragic, because Achilles has swung from this mega sulk into this mega quest for vengeance, and he relentlessly goes for Hector. Hector knows that the likelihood is that he'll be killed because Achilles is the best of the Greeks. But the code of honour of the heroes means that he has to kind of answer the call. He comes out and he is indeed killed. And then this is where Achilles reveals his dark side, because he abuses the body of the dead Hector in the most appalling way. He ties it to his chariot, he drags it round the walls of Troy with the family of Hector looking down from the battlements and so on. It's a very, very tragic scene because he's just got completely carried away. Excessive vengeance.
For the Greek army, triumph was about to be eclipsed by tragedy. With Hector gone, victory was within their grasp, and convinced Troy was about to fall, they surged towards the Scaean gate. In the midst of battle, Paris, his arms strengthened and his aim directed by Apollo, loosed an arrow at Achilles. Guided by the gods, the arrow found the only part of Achilles' body that was vulnerable, his heel. Achilles fell, mortally wounded.
a very good example of how the Greek myths and heroes come down to us. We use the expression nowadays, don't we? It's his Achilles heel, and it comes from the great hero Achilles, because his mother Thetis was told that he could become immortal if he was dipped into the black waters of the river Styx. And so she did this, but as with any mother, she hung on to him. She didn't want to let him go. She just held him by what we now call his Achilles tendon, and that one portion of him didn't go into the river, and that was mortal, and that was the way he died.
With the death of Achilles and Hector, the great heroes of both sides were gone, and the fighting degenerated into a bloody stalemate, with no side able to gain the upper hand. The Iliad says that, "Toiled they in the fight, the wind's breath rolled huge dust clouds up. The air was one thick haze, the earth disappeared, faces were blotted out, yet still they fought on. Each man whom so he met ruthlessly slew him, though his very friend it might be. In that turmoil none could tell who met him, friend or foe." How was the stalemate to be ended? It would need more than muscles and might and help from the gods to break down the walls of Troy. Homer's epic legend tells us that it was Odysseus who had the idea for the deceit that was to make Troy famous forever.
The wooden horse of Troy is one of the most memorable episodes in the whole of the epic cycle, and yet it's the one which, apart from the interventions of gods and goddesses, makes us wonder most whether any of this wonderful story has a basis in truth. The idea that an army could build a great horse of wood, hide within it a number of warriors, and persuade their enemies to pull down the walls and bring the horse inside, is pure fantasy of the highest poetic order.
Historically, a lot of people would dismiss the Trojan horse as an anachronism or a piece of poetic symbolism. As a matter of fact, I think it is quite conceivable that such a thing could have been used in siege warfare. Not that the siege warfare was highly developed, but it could have been used as an innovation in the late Bronze Age in some attack on some city.
The Iliad tells us that for 3 days the Greeks laboured. When the wooden horse was finished, it was an awe-inspiring sight, exquisitely carved and large enough to hold 20 warriors within its hollow body. Into the beast climbed some of the bravest Greek soldiers, amongst them Odysseus, Diomedes, Menelaus and Philoctetes. There they waited, all in silence, sat betwixt victory and death. Meanwhile, the Greek army withdrew from the city walls and abandoned their camps in an attempt to convince the Trojans that they'd given up the siege at last. The Trojans could hardly believe their eyes. The Greek army had disappeared. Relieved and ecstatic, they gathered around the colossal horse and looked on in wonder. To add to the deceit, a soldier pretending to be a deserter from the Greek army convinced the Trojans that the offering was touched by magic, and that all the while the horse was kept within the city walls, the city would never be captured.
The wooden horse was dragged into the city. Some of the legends say that part of the city wall was actually broken down to let the horse in. And of course concealed inside it was this band of Greeks. There was one priest, Laocoon, who spoke against it. He said, no, this was dangerous. And Apollo, and Laocoon was a priest of Apollo, Apollo was on the side of the Greeks, so he sent serpents to kill Laocoon, to shut his mouth.
Helen is another who's suspicious. She wanders around the horse, crying out the names of various Greek soldiers, imitating the voices of their wives to see if she'll get any response. And inside the horse there's pandemonium, as various soldiers want to reply but are held back by Odysseus. Having succeeded in avoiding disclosure, the troops on the horse wait for nightfall. During the night, the Greek fleet returns from the island of Tenedos, where it had harboured, waiting for the horse to be brought into the town. There's a signal from one of the ships, and at the signal we're told that Sinon goes and unbolts some of the planks of the horse, allowing the Greek soldiers to get into the town.
Under the cover of darkness, the Greek army had returned to surround the city, and as their comrades unlocked the city gates, they burst into the town. Now there was nothing to stop them, and the slaughter could begin. Few were spared the wrath of the Greeks. Fires swept through the city streets, burning wounded men alive. The flames soon engulfed King Priam's palace, and the king himself was murdered before the very eyes of his son, Prince Aeneas.
And then there's the most terrible sack of Troy, and women and children are killed, everything is burnt, princesses and queens become enslaved, and so on and so forth. It's a very, very tragic, the defining fall of a city for the ancient Greeks for thousands of years afterwards.
The Greeks are said to have committed many unspeakable acts as they took their revenge on those that had stood against them for so long. Women were taken as slaves, and the great treasures of Troy were seized. But what of Helen? After all, she was the woman for whom Greeks and Trojans had done battle for 10 long years.
Helen's portrayed by Homer in his poem, the Iliad, in actually a very sympathetic way, in that she's not presented as a woman who's kind of reveling in her adultery. She's presented as a woman who's ashamed of what she's done. The story as to what happens to her after Troy falls, it varies a bit. There are different ancient versions. In one version, Menelaus, her husband, the king of Sparta, is determined that actually he's going to kill her once he gets his hands on her, in revenge for her adultery. In other versions, they're reconciled and they live happily ever after back in Sparta.
So that is the story of Troy, a story familiar to many of us, the story that inspired some of literature's leading lights, the story that has latterly provided the material for the great and the good of the movie world to build their addition to the legend. But let's sum up the evidence for any truth in the tale, any clues at all that at least some of the events portrayed in the Iliad may actually have happened. At least we know that Troy, or a city on the site of Troy, actually existed. Excavations have proved that. The argument that the original mound discovered by Schliemann in the 19th century could never have held the large Trojan army has been dispelled by modern archaeologists, who discovered a large lower citadel at the site. But the 10-year siege, however, is entirely unsupported by any historical evidence. It appears to be another facet of the legend of Troy. How marvellous it would be to be able to prove that Helen of Troy, the most beautiful woman in the world, the beguiling creature who captured the heart of Paris, actually existed. Certainly there are those who believe that Helen, or someone very like her, was a real woman, but sadly it's almost certainly a case of wishful thinking. There is nothing in history that suggests she lived. It seems that Helen and her legendary beauty were merely the figment of a fertile male imagination. Nothing new there. It seems too that her handsome lover Paris, the son of the king of Troy, is just another part of the great legend. The story of Troy features some of the greatest warriors in Greek and Trojan legend. Although he is supposed to be the son of the mortal Peleus, there is no historical proof that the Greek warrior Achilles was based upon any living hero. We have to content ourselves with the story of Thetis, his mother, and her attempts to make her son immortal by dipping him in the sacred waters of the river Styx. But she held him by his heel, which didn't get wet, so leaving it unprotected. We can only imagine his fight with the mighty Hector, the Trojan champion, and his death by an arrow shot by Paris but aided by the god Apollo, which struck him in his vulnerable heel. Bad luck indeed. In one way, of course, Achilles is still alive in a language that uses Achilles' heel as the euphemism for a weak or vulnerable spot. How wonderful it would be, too, if it could be proved that Achilles, Odysseus, Hector, Ajax and the rest were once flesh and blood in some form. Happily for romantics and lovers of myths and legends everywhere, it can't. If we can't prove that a siege ever took place at the city of Troy, then surely the famous story of the wooden horse is another piece of mythical invention. Or is it? Is it, in fact, the one piece of the story of the siege that, incredibly, may have some basis in historical truth?
In Anatolia, in the late Bronze Age, it was quite common for people to have libation vessels, which were animal-shaped. Furthermore, there is evidence from a set of Hittite sculptures in central Anatolia that there were life-size vessels of this sort, on occasion, on wheels, used in religious ceremonies. The sculptures at Alacahuyuk in central Turkey have depict a religious procession with, at the end of it, a life-sized bull on wheels with a spout on the top. It was a libation vessel. Such things may, for all we know, have been quite common. And at any rate, they were known in late Bronze Age Anatolia, and I don't see why some enterprising general might not once have used one for getting into a besieged city.
The science of archaeology has enabled us to make many incredible discoveries, to uncover many hidden or lost secrets, to help us view the past in a brilliant new light. Archaeologists have established that a city, probably Troy, stood in roughly the same place and time as that identified in the Homeric legend. But that is where the historical trail ends. The great cast of characters from the story, Helen, Paris, Achilles, Hector and the rest, are just that. Characters in a wonderful, vibrant, enduring story that has somehow survived the passing centuries. Meanwhile, the splendid, romantic, brave, glorious and doomed city of Troy, given birth in Homer's extraordinary tale, simply refuses to die.
I think the reason why the legend of Troy survives must, above all, be the way in which Homer transformed it into this extraordinary epic tale, which you can still read today with enormous pleasure. He creates out of these heroes figures of enormous humanity whom it's possible for us to relate to, like Achilles. I mean, Achilles, in spite of his superhuman heroic status, is also a very, very human figure. He understands when the father of the dead Hector pleads with him to release the body so that the family can give it a decent burial. And there's this wonderful scene where Achilles and the father, who's an old man, Priam, King Priam, they sit together and they're both weeping over their respective grief. Achilles over Patroclus and Priam over Hector. And Achilles responds, he says, yes, take the body back. So I think it's the fact that so many of the heroes and heroines are real and human, and of course the gods and goddesses are as well. I mean, you have Hera, the wife of Zeus, the king of the gods, who's constantly nagging Zeus and getting the better of him. So it's kind of like a soap opera in some way, and I think the characters are ones which we can recognise and which just make the kind of intervening 2,000 years just drop away.